Welcome to Season 3 of the Brick and Wonder podcast. This season is different. For our first two seasons, we explored ideas across conversations with multiple voices in each episode. We surfaced patterns, tensions, and themes across the built environment. That approach gave us range. Season 3 is about depth. Each episode will feature a single guest, one conversation, more time, more rigor, more candor. We are going deeper into the thinking of people shaping our cities, our buildings, and the systems behind them. Our aim is simple: to unearth perspectives and insights that are both inspiring and actionable for professionals working across the built environment. Architecture, development, construction, planning, policy, capital, design, these disciplines do not operate in isolation. They shape how people live. Season 3 is about understanding the individuals who are shaping that future and extracting lessons you can apply in your own work. I'm Drew Lang.
I'm Ravi Arps.
You're listening to the Brick and Wonder podcast.
Are you building for yourself, or are you building for the people who are going to occupy and walk by your building, not just today, but 100 years from now? Are you thinking 100 years from now? And from a politician, are you doing something that is expedient today, or are you doing something that is ultimately right? And right and wrong, these questions of morality, very difficult to tease out, but the right thing for your polity in the future.
For our first episode of Season 3, we are joined by Coby Lefkowitz. Coby is an urbanist, real estate developer, writer, and professor. He represents a new generation of leaders who are not content to simply build projects, but are intent on shaping policy, influencing systems, and improving lives through better housing and urban planning. He is a rising force in the industry, poised to do work that meaningfully impacts how our cities evolve and who they serve. In this conversation, we discuss barriers that make housing so difficult to produce in the United States. We examine past movements and what it would take to develop new housing at scale today. And we dig into something unexpected. Why does fashion command public imagination in ways that real estate and design rarely do? What can our industry learn from fashion's ability to capture attention, shape culture, and create narrative? If we believe the built environment shapes how people live, then why has it struggled to capture the cultural spotlight? This episode sets the tone for the season: thoughtful, practical, and forward-looking. Here's our conversation with Coby Lefkowitz.
For listeners, who are you? How did you get here?
Yeah, this is a story I don't know that I've told publicly, maybe once, but I have a very big family and they're very supportive, which is beautiful. But sometimes that support isn't always fully supported. And here's what I mean by that. When I wrote my first article, it was a defense of New York, sort of in this transitory period, pre, during, and then post-COVID. I sent the article to my family and said, this is the first thing I've written publicly. I've been writing sort of in the background for the last 4 or 5 years, synthesizing my thoughts and gathering them. Would really appreciate if you guys could take a look at it. And the messages started pouring in. This is fantastic. Bravo. Proud of you that you're taking this public leap. But the wonderful thing about writing online is you have data. And you can go and look who actually read your article. And I have dozens of family members who sent me messages. 2 of them read it. And only 1 of them made it to the bottom, right? So I came in with no expectations that I would have any audience for my perspectives on the built environment. It was purely as an expression of what I wanted to see in the world. And this was a reconciliation of development, design, and planning, bringing all 3 of those together. Fast forward over some years, I continued beating this drum, which was basically, we can build places anew that are not only merely good, but exceptional and rival the best of what we've built in the past, we don't have to accept for the status quo that I think a lot of people, especially outside of New York, find deeply unsatisfying. There's so much worth celebrating in the built environment. People don't see this. You might see behind us in the backdrop Frank Gehry's skyscraper in the financial district, or the World Trade Center, or JP Morgan's new skyscraper on Park Avenue, but you don't see the duplex that was built in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. You don't see a new modest office building that was erected in Savannah that is a very good contributing member of the fabric, because it doesn't stand out, doesn't rise above buildings around it, right? And yet it undoubtedly makes the quality of Savannah, in this case, or Grosse Pointe, or whatever city or town one wants to mention, better for its contribution. And 5, 6, 7 years after doing that, there's now a body of advocacy work in promoting good design in the built environment, and we can get into what good design actually means. But that's sort of my background. And then professionally, I'm a real estate developer, so I take it upon me to try to instantiate these beliefs back into the built environment, and not merely be an advocate, but someone who's putting some skin in the game.
Got it. So politics.
Politics.
Is that in your future?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Well, I think it potentially risks me alienating folks who I revere and want to work with in the future, who might believe things differently than I do. I've been very fortunate enough to get to travel around the world the last few years to talk with people about how to build better cities. And I think this is a completely bipartisan on one side, or a nonpartisan project on the other. And if I come out very firmly in one position, something that is as anodyne, or I believe is anodyne, is advocating for protected bike lanes to make sure cyclists can get to home or office or pick up their kids safely. But then someone sees a comment I've made on another topic that they might not agree with, then the project of building bike lanes or improving public housing in New York City becomes tainted, which I think is unfair, of course, but people can't, or very rarely have the opportunity to sit down with you for 2 hours and say, well, Ravi, why do you believe this in all its nuance, as opposed to the soundbite to say, well, I'm going to get you on this. And I do believe that being mission-driven on this one topic will allow me to go further in my advocacy than if I broadened that and perhaps diluted it. But if the people...
What is the advocacy? What is the mission that you're referring to?
The broad mission is, in New York City specifically, and then I can talk about this nationally, we have housing crises that are imperiling our largest cities, but of course cities in small towns around the country. And that's one part of the problem. It's a very simple problem to solve. Theoretically, it's difficult politically, and we can get into why that is. But on top of that, I think that we need to go further and not settle for a utilitarian base of New York City, 500,000 units short of demand. The United States, 6 to 8 million units short of demand, depending on what survey we look at. We need to say that what that housing looks like and feels like, what sort of communities it contributes to, matters deeply. And that can sometimes be a little more difficult to describe, because what does a proper housing solution in Brooklyn look like as compared to one in Dallas? They're going to be a little bit different. And so it's not a set prescriptive policy.
Well, but who is in the right position to make that decision? I mean, who is to say what is good? And, also, what's the difference between that in a theoretical sense and that in a lived sense?
Good is subjective from an architectural perspective, but from an urban design perspective, we can measure how people feel in different environments. So I won't make a comment as to whether Art Nouveau or Art Deco is a better style, but I can tell you that you're going to feel more comfortable in an environment and safer if the right-of-way widths on streets are 30 feet wide as opposed to 100 feet wide. We will feel better in the built environment if we live on a street with trees as opposed to one that's completely bereft of them. And these are urban design decisions before you get to broader architectural decisions. And so when I talk about design, it's all encompassing of those, but I think 80% of the work of what constitutes good doesn't really have an aesthetic valence to it. I deeply care about aesthetics. That last 20% really matters, but one can go to Seoul or La Paz or Venice, and you can be from 3 other vastly different parts of the world, and you don't need to be taught that Venice is a beautiful city, right? Even though it looks completely different than Seoul, which is an attractive city, even if it has different architectural styles, right? Because the same basic principles of urban design are consistent across those places. I could go further there, but I'll put a pin in that for now.
Starting to the topic of politics, specifically Trump's executive order mandating that federal buildings be designed in the classical style, and simultaneously mandating that the government sell or otherwise dispose of modernist buildings owned by the government. Thoughts on that, Coby?
I'll start by saying I don't think there should be a mandate for any style, whether it's classical or if it's modernist with a capital M. Though we did have a de facto design for many decades that is consistent in a lot of our federal or state buildings that were erected, even though there was nothing put pen to paper. I think it's actually unfortunate for folks who are, if not fans, but advocates like me of classical architecture. I'm not a classicist, I'll say. I love it. I love contemporary architecture. I love modern architecture. There's beauty to be found across all the schools. But it becomes politicized, right? It takes on the dogma of the person who proposes it. And I think that's wrong. I reject that. Though I do think, maybe this is a provocation, it's good to bring back this conversation that classical buildings have a place in the American conception of itself architecturally. I mean, this is what our founding fathers predicated the image of DC on, or we're not too far away from Federal Hall here, this neoclassical vision of a new Rome, the third Rome that has been revived and resurrected many times.
Third Rome. What was the second one?
Well, this is sort of this notion historically that you have the first Rome. I actually think the second might have been Byzantium or
Byzantine Empire.
Yeah, Constantinople. And then the third is this historical legacy. And I'm not a scholar on Christendom in the way that, or Latindom is maybe I would like to be. It has been a mantle that cities have tried to pull forward for millennia to say we are the inheritors of the Roman Empire. And this is certainly something.
At least its styles, if not its values.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That has always had a part in the American canon of architecture. And there was a blip in that for some decades. I welcome a return of that. I do not welcome saying every structure needs to be designed in this style. Because even if we really want to get wonky about this, a lot of buildings that seem classical are not. They have elements that are Baroque. They have elements that are Rococo, elements that maybe there's some other schools that are blended here and there. So this strict fidelity to a single style is wrong, and it's sort of ahistoric. Architecture is this amalgam of a lot of different styles applied and ever evolving. As for your second question, what should we do with buildings that are not in keeping with the prevailing sense of style? They're démodé now in some way. I think principally we should be concerned about their function. So I'm imagining the building that you're referencing is the FBI headquarters in DC. From what I've heard from folks in DC, that's not a building that functions quite well. Now, the valence that this has taken is a style wars. We're clashing classicism versus modernism. And I think that's counterproductive. What should replace that building? Because I think there is broad consensus that it is not, well, maybe it needs to be renovated. That's a conversation we could have. But what should replace it is not for me to say. I do think to some extent all architecture is a reflection of both those in power and the polity who support those in power.
Do you take it as sincere?
No, I don't think it's a sincere effort. I mean, if we are looking at the figurehead of this movement federally, has Trump developed anything in a classical style? He's not gone to the ICAA in Midtown and said, oh, I've discovered that I am the next inheritor of Vitruvius. So I don't find it earnest in that sense. There are people in his administration who certainly are, but I think for him it's a political gambit.
This podcast is supported by Madera, offering an integrated collection of high-quality wood products. They provide seamless wood design that simplifies wood finish specification. My architecture firm has worked with Madera on several projects where they provided wood material for flooring, doors, and cabinetry. Their product line and approach created an integrated result and made the process easier, not just for my team, but also for the project contractors and mill workers. I personally recommend Madera. You can learn more about them at maderasurfaces.com. Let's maybe segue away from politics, stay in some sense on the notion of what's good, what's effective, and shift to things outside of architecture and how people in other realms have been successful in, let's say, moving the needle of conversation, of capturing attention, of advancement in some sense. So fashion, for instance, is successful in capturing the zeitgeist. Whereas in the world of architecture, design, the built environment, we're not successful in the same way. And we're quite good at talking with each other, but we're very ineffective when we talk to the public. And, if I'm honest, I think we not only bore them, we bore ourselves. And one of the reasons I'm interested in someone like you leading this dialogue is you seem to know how to advance the dialogue in a way that sustains energy and attention, which I think is critically important.
The reason why a given design can capture the zeitgeist in fashion and it might have trouble in architecture is that architects are a little too promiscuous with their designs. And I'm certainly guilty of this as well. I love many different schools and styles to sort of get back to the aesthetic conversation. But when one thinks about a certain fashion house, immediately there is resonance with a certain silhouette of a shoe, or it's a certain way that a dress flows, or it's a certain color scheme. And okay, this is Ferragamo, or this is Gucci, or whatever it might be. But in contemporary architecture, it's very difficult to say who has a signature style. And there are a few offices and practices, of course. Zaha Hadid's firm is famous for the curves and remarkably elegant structures. Geary with sort of these fluid, almost prismatic, metallic structures are really wonderful. But a lot of other practices don't have that signature design. The firms that maybe from a transactional perspective are regarded as the most successful, who I have great respect for, let's say an SOM or KPF, or Gensler is probably the greatest example of this. They're extraordinarily productive and they're creating buildings and value in the billions and billions of dollars. But one would be hard pressed to say, if they're outside of the architecture community, what buildings they've done, even though they are the most successful practices or among the most successful practices. And I think this ties back into advocacy, where the single most important thing one can do is to have message consistency and to almost caricature oneself.
What do you mean by that?
So here's how I caricature myself. I care about aesthetics in the built environment. I care about good design in the built environment. And I care about bringing down the cost of housing. I could write 10,000-word essays on each of those, and you guys would know with great detail exactly what I think. Or I could say, pretty building good, build a lot of pretty buildings. And people go, well, there's really no mistaking what you mean there. And if you continue to say that, I don't need to go into the nuance of, well, if you understand that in the architectural tradition of continental cities that we revere, they're drawing back on 1,000 years of precedent to inform relations between the human body and climate and context. And that's why we have columns that are 3 feet in width compared to 10 feet in height, or whatever it might be, these proportions. Those messages get lost. And I think this is your point, Drew, like why architects can speak volubly amongst ourselves, or I can't call myself an architect, designers or design professionals can talk volubly. But when we have to go outside of the academy, we struggle. because these are very complex considerations, and there is a reticence to bring oneself down from the ivory tower to say, there doesn't need to be a grand notion of what a building is. Let's just make it beautiful.
Do you think there's a difference in the practice of a fashion house versus a architecture firm, in the sense that a lot of architects do custom work?
Yeah.
So to what extent can they have a style that is attributable to them, whereas, a fashion house will hire a certain artistic director for the sole purpose of putting out a line that says something very, very specific. And hopefully it captures the zeitgeist. Sometimes it fails, but it's not interactive, custom really at all. There are custom clothes makers. Who knows who they are? It strikes me that a lot of architects are akin to a custom clothes maker, as opposed to someone who has complete artistic freedom and capital to put out a singular idea to be discussed one way or the other, hated or loved.
That's a really wonderful point. And when you were saying that, it made me think about costume designers on Broadway. They can create really wonderful pieces for a given production, but we don't know who they are. And they're extraordinarily talented, right? But it's custom. And so they don't have a style. From production to production, they must change. And maybe this is the case. I think there's a provocative answer here, which sometimes is the right answer. I don't think it's the case here. I think there's an unsexy answer. The provocative one is that fashion designers don't pretend to care about anything other than aesthetics. And so it's not the structure of the dress or of the jacket, it's how it looks. It is purely a visceral aesthetic experience. But in the practice of architecture, there's a lot more going on there, which is closer to contemporary art. So as opposed to, which should be an aesthetic experience, but it's sort of taken on a level of morality and abstraction that is why a lot of folks who are not in the art world feel as though they can't relate to it. But in architecture, it's not just the building. It's about what it represents. It's about what the site context is and what you're responding to. What are we in dialogue with? Who will this be for in a century? How can I talk to the connection of the laborer who may never step on the site here, but one day may see themselves in the stone, for example? And the most successful architects are able to, the architects that are most closely associated with the style, that have this message clarity, sort of put that away. They say, I'm going to design a beautiful structure with flowing curves, and my trademark is going to be rending aluminum as it rounds the corner of a structure, for example. But in a lot of the more academic conceptions of architecture, it's not so simple. And it's very difficult to get one's message out of what they're about if you have to understand 7 different layers of what a simple structure represents. So I don't fully agree with that it's a simple binary between fashion houses and designers are able to be vulgar, and I don't mean this in a pejorative way, I mean the etymological root of this, vulgar, of the masses, popular, right? To create popular designs that people will like, versus architects who have to deal with more utilitarian considerations. I think there's a lot of truth of what you say. If you cannot create your own signature style because of the constraints of your client work, you can't ever develop that. It's sort of a catch-22.
Mm-hmm. Harder. Because there are structural considerations to fashion clothes as well. There's performance considerations to clothing. Is it going to keep you warm? Is it going to irritate your skin? Are the seams going to tear? How many wash cycles will it survive? All that's true there too. But I suspect that it has a lot to do with what the job of an architect has become. It is to make real the unspoken and spoken, implicit and explicit aspirations of their client, whether it's a public client or a private client. Tell me what you want, what you need, how you want to express yourself, and let me try to bring to bear my experience and subtle aspects of my style to help you, but really it's about you, helping you realize your vision. And it's very different than any sort of fashion. And I wonder, is it a disservice to the client ultimately?
It's so interesting. As you say this, my mind's going to do two different things. The first note is when the public responds negatively to architecture, are they responding to these private commissions? How often do they see them? Right? That maybe that's part of the consideration. But I think on social media, there are a lot of private commissions that are represented as very favorably in the public. And it's more the utilitarian try. Maybe it's a problem of dignifying certain sites with the wrong level of gravity. So it would be as though there's nothing wrong at all with getting one's jeans and sweaters from Walmart, but it's a much more utilitarian and more to the point way of dressing oneself. But it would be as though in architecture, sometimes the most prominent buildings are dressed in Walmart jeans. And should those be expressed in that way, or should it be in more elegant and aspirational modes? I'm not sure. So let's put that to the side first. And then second, do we do a disservice? There is a rich tradition of 20th century case study houses in architecture that shows designers like Le Corbusier or Mies van der Rohe. Well, Mies's structures were a little more sound. But we can take all these case study homes, and they're very fashionable, and people collect magazines on Le Corbusier today, and they have posters in their homes and apartments. But famously, he designed a house for his mother, and it didn't work. She was asking to move out after a year. And so there might have been a disservice to the client, but broadly, it progressed the practice of architecture forward. And so maybe some clients need to be patrons and fall on the sword for the practice. Sometimes it'll be successful, and sometimes it won't be.
Or maybe there needs to be more developed in the way of productized architecture or productized design, packaged design that someone can clearly understand, identify, and purchase. People have consistently tried. I think you're right to point to the case study movement, having been somewhat successful in this regard and really captured people's attention successfully. But then there was, for a long period of time, and it continues largely to this day, a rejection of that modern expression as boxy, plain, undesirable, unrepresentative of individual expression. So how do we solve for this, right? We were talking before about this rarefied part of the world that we operate in, where a client will commission a private, one-off commission, a home, say, being akin to a custom-tailored suit. And these things kind of operating below the radar where people aren't aware of it. And so, therefore, maybe they can't capture the public's attention. Whereas, when you think about fashion, most of it, of course, is ready to wear. There isn't really the equivalent in architecture. Maybe the closest thing is IKEA, or the kind of things that one puts in their home, right? And I think that is a good place to begin. A lot of interesting design does start there. Product design, if you will, that touches architecture and the built environment and the way people live. But how does that then extend?
What about though, like spec homes or like these developments, right? You'll have like 100 homes built. They're all kind of the same in a development. You live in Worcester Heights gated community, and all the homes are of that type. Like, oh, I live in Meadow Lane gated community, and it's a different type. And so I moved to this neighborhood, and which one do I want? Mm-hmm. And neither one of them is about much of your personal expression. It might be slight differences in how it's situated in the land, but it's all about how am I going to personalize this home, and I'm going to live in it now. Is that Walmart? Is that bad? Is it good? Is it better? Should we have more of that? Certainly we could build faster, and we could build better over time. It could be cheaper. This is what I mean by disservice to the public, not to the individual, because I think there's always a market and a place for that. But we look down on that. Why not, instead of looking down on it and going to the opposite extreme, do it again and do it better?
Yeah.
Make it more interesting. Just put it out there. And someone's going to choose that one, and that person might blow up. Curious to hear you opine on this. You're talking a lot about making a house prettier and more of it. How can you do that when it's academic and custom and bespoke? How can it be anything other than that? to get to these 500,000, 6
Yeah.
million homes?
I think we have to fall somewhere in the middle. It can't be custom. And I think architects need to, there are some who do this. They're more in the South. We don't see this in the Northeast. There are some in the West, but it's very popular in the South for some designers to create pattern books where they'll take these plans to a community. And Allison Ramsey is the firm at the top of my mind who does this. They do a lot of work in South Carolina. They're sort of twee structures, right? But you place them in a suburb of Charleston or of Columbia or of Charlotte, and they've done many hundreds of homes. They've just drawn the plans once, and then a local architect will run it through the permitting process. And that's slightly better. It's much better than the status quo of Meadow Lane or whatever community it might be. And I actually think better than the bungalows and craftsman homes that were mass produced a century ago by Sears catalog houses and a number of other firms that competed in that space, but today which retain great affection. People fight to live over what was once a mail-delivered kit house, right? And I think we need to move closer to that, where there still is an architect's hand at the beginning of that process. And right now, Drew, you would know better than I, or Rob maybe as well, how many homes designed in America or built in America are designed by an architect? It's very few.
What do you mean?
Most homes that are built in America, there's no architectural direction. In Meadow Lane, the 100 homes in our gated community, it's basically blueprints that are sketched up by a builder. Right? And so we don't have architects who graduated from Syracuse or from Cooper Union or name whatever program or SciArc who are behind these plans. They're much more rudimentary. And
Why?
Well, I think that's why we're having this discussion. Why? Why aren't the professionals more central to the conversation and then to the actions that then matter, that have bearing on the built environment and people's lived experience? And I don't have the answer. That's why I'm asking the question. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but it is, it's something like 1% of the homes in the U.S. are designed by architects, right? So it's quite sad commentary on us culturally speaking, right? Whereas, jump to fashion, we go out in the street and see, who's wearing Calvin Klein, a good portion of the population. So there's been a proliferation in the world of fashion of high design, good design, and it touches people's lives in a meaningful way. We're asking the question, why can't that be the case for people's lived experience, especially in the home, right? I think we want to carry it through to the public realm and public buildings as well, but it really can begin and be most effective in the realm of residential architecture. And, we should be looking back at the success stories of not just the case study homes, but the, craftsman homes, the catalog homes. Ravi and I happen to be working on one of these right now that was designed by Gustav Stickley, built out of a book of homes. In fact, we have the book in our studio, and you can just turn to the page that is this home, and it's
amazing,
wonderful. Yeah, and so that tells you that it is possible. So why did we stop doing that? When did it stop? Why did it stop? You could argue that it actually didn't stop. It just evolved to a lesser place, right? To the gated home, to, Pastoral Way, or, whatever the place might be that we're talking about in the suburbs of America that have proliferated in the post-war years, in 1945 and on. We've been going in the wrong direction. And urbanists tried to, change direction, and I think had the right intentions, but really ended up going in, I would argue, much of the same direction, where the architecture and, the places, the experience of the streetscape didn't have soul. So I'll turn the question back to Coby.
All right, so I actually think synthesizing both, I have some sense of this now, but this is why you push off the question and then maybe it comes back to you. It's wonderful. So Calvin Klein's a really good example. Ralph Lauren's also maybe the better example. So what have those designers done? Well, they've branded themselves in a way where they aren't the figurehead. Most people don't know that those are real people. They don't know that Ralph Lauren exists or Calvin Klein's a real person. They think it's just some fake fashion house. And the note that I was writing here is they have responded to popular demands. So Ralph Lauren, there's Polo, but then he has RRL. So he sort of has the elevated. He's these two different tiers, one for me, Purple Label, and then one for everyone else. Popularly, these are polos or T-shirts or jeans that anyone could see themselves in, but they do have a higher veneer of design. So it's raising that level. It's different than an ASOS or a Zara or an H&M, this fast fashion. The equivalent of that is probably the tract home community in suburban Nashville. So it's one step above that, but they're still responding to the demands of the market. And I don't know that architects are always doing that. I think architects oftentimes, yes, there's a lot of client work that they take on, but the idea of an architect is as this artist, and I'm going to lead the charge. And even if my client says they give me the specs, a 5,000 square foot house in the mountains, and so I want to preserve some views across the valley, whatever the case may be, they're still driving a lot of those decisions. And it's definitely the case on the case study houses, right? I think that pedagogically, when one goes through architecture school, you are taught to lean into that creative ethos, into that spirit, to say, you are an individual. Maybe you get ground down when you go into practice. That's a different question as a draftsman or woman for 5 years, and then you have different conceptions of the profession. But I don't think you're taught, or I know you're not taught, to think like a business person and to say, well, what is the market demanding? And I do think that if there were a Ralph Lauren figure in architecture who says, I'm going to provide, so how do we take that 1% of houses up to 20% of houses designed by architects? I will give you the 20% better McMansion. And I think a lot of it's urban design, so there's some that's outside of the architect's control, but I'll give you the 20% better. You can say, I live in the Ralph Lauren home, which maybe not everyone wants to, and then I can still have a part of my practice that's the Purple Label. So the projects for me that are innovative, daring, experimental, I can still do them, but I'm willing to suppress my ego to get to that 20% market share. And I don't know that architects think like that. I think they want to be...
But developers do. So you're a developer,
Yeah.
An enlightened one. Why haven't developers, from an entrepreneurial vantage point, taken on this mantle, commissioned the creative folks?
I think we used to. If you look at this stories of 19th and early 20th century American development patterns, this explosion of population in cities, not just New York and Chicago, places like Baltimore and Kansas City. I mean, name any city in the country, Cincinnati, have these massive population swells, and there's developers who are building tract housing, the equivalent of our suburban Nashville homes today, that are extremely popular to the point that, we all live in these neighborhoods or aspire to live in these neighborhoods today, but they were the mass-produced 20% better than what one could have conceived of before. I think part of it does come from the developer, but the role of the architect has undoubtedly changed post the movement of modernism, where designers conceive of themselves as something fundamentally different than what they were in the 19th century or in the early 20th century, where they were more generalist, they were less specialized. Architects would also be engineers, they would also be planners, they would also think about the financials. I just finished a wonderful book from Clarence Stein, Towards New Towns for America. He's a planner, but also an architect. And it's amazing to read, whether his numbers were actually right or not, the amount of thought that he gave to each one of his projects in terms of how do they pencil? How do we actually scale up our vision? How do we take this from something that could be a nice idea? He was an accolade of the Garden Cities movement. So Ebenezer Howard, he's a British architect and planner, and expanded as much as possible. And he oversaw the creation of many thousands of homes, starting, or maybe not starting, but most notably in New York with Sunnyside Gardens, if you guys are familiar, which is a really magnificent project. Radburn in New Jersey, which was this prototype suburban community. And then there were a lot of large, like Greenbelt, Maryland was, I think, the largest example of this. but other greenbelt communities that were built. That sort of architect doesn't really exist today. Who is the architect who's saying, I'm willing to go to the suburbs of Phoenix and create something marginally better and stake my name on it? We would scoff at it. We'd say, well, I'm not doing a subdivision there. I want the Brooklyn Heights townhouse. I want to design the Miami Beach estate or the tower there. That's sort of my sense. It could be wrong.
So there's an elitism.
Oh, there's no doubt there's an elitism.
It's getting in the way. Yeah. What about Cliff May, sort of the father of the ranch home? He built over 1,000 homes, mostly across California, extending beyond California in the West. And same kind of thing that you're talking about. Very business-oriented, very entrepreneurial in spirit. He designed, built, and sold homes. And, they flew off the shelves. You couldn't, build them fast enough. There was tremendous demand for them. Would you say that if there were some version of this today, that there may be the possibility of capturing the public's attention?
It's interesting. Bjarke Ingels tried to do this, or he still is. Their practice is working on some of these projects, but they, I believe, sat in the developer seat of, and Ravi, you might know better than I, this project in San Jose. It was an apartment deal, and they've done some A-frame houses in the Catskills, and they've dipped their toes there. But I absolutely think there would be strong demand for this, even if you don't have the true believers who say, I want to live in a big house, but they would appreciate the level of design. But it would require something I often talk about with our buildings and in my advocacy work. It would require coming down from the pursuit of perfection to the pursuit of really good. And really good might be 85%. It's not 100, but you can get to 85, and that might take you, throwing out a time period, let's say 6 months of really good design work. But then to get to 100 could take you 10 years or longer in that pursuit of perfection. So I think it will require, even if a practice is not subsumed with elitism, which some certainly are, but there are a lot who aren't, to be okay with being better than the status quo, but not pushing forward. And how do you say that to designers? Put the pencils down at a certain point. Let's settle for merely good enough or better than what is now. It's a tough argument to make, but I think pushing in that direction would find significant demand, because we do have to remember most of the public know nothing about architecture. They're not thinking about it.
We have two customary questions that we ask as we close out the podcast. And the first one is, what are you currently doing wrong, and what are you doing to fix that?
I have two partners that I work with in our practice, and they're fantastic. I love them. They're two of my closest friends. We do things very ad hoc. And what that means is we're flying by the seat of our pants. We're saying yes to any project we can take on. I mean, you guys will know how this goes. You just run in gung-ho. And because of that, we don't always have the best preparation. We've now, as we've scaled, gotten to take on more, if not institutionalized opportunities where there are very rigid protocols. So we might have 5 meetings in a given week that for me and my partners would be a 20-minute phone call. And if we need to talk about anything else, we will just hop on as we see fit. What we're doing is not the right way of going about it. We definitely need to have some more standardization to allow us to grow with more stability. I don't know that we should be going all the way. I mean, it's why I left the corporate world. I knew very early on when I was working in a real estate investment trust and interned at some private equity firms that being in a practice with more than 20 people, there's just too much going on for me, right? It was, after a certain point, it's not 20, I sort of say that in jest, but maybe 75, 100, 200 people, the crux of what one is working on in a firm adds all these layers where now you're having meetings about meetings about meetings, and it takes you away from your work. So there needs to be some level of that, but I want to be careful that it doesn't balloon, where everything that surrounds the given project, let's say the kernel of the project, is now surrounded by some nonsense that isn't. But we definitely need to have some more of this buffer. And like in brass tacks, what does that mean? We all work from home, and we'll go into offices or WeWorks here and there as fit. But I think sitting in a beautiful office like this, like there's considerable benefit to that. And running our practice entirely remote for 5 years, I want to be in an office. I want to be colliding with the ideas of my partners and whoever we bring into the office. I think we need to have more standardized calls. I don't think we should have 5 calls a day, because as a generally creative person, I get 2 calls and my mind is just melting for the day. I need to set aside 4 or 5 hours to like get deep work done, or else nothing's getting done during the day. But yeah, we're doing something wrong with how we organize our time. And I want to move a little bit further along the continuum to stability, but not all the way there. Some chaos is important.
And the second question is, what is a question that you have that you'd like answered by your colleagues in the industry? You know, if you were to pose a similar type of question that we posed to you, what is something that you think everyone should answer?
What is your civic obligation? If you are a developer or a designer or a politician, what do you believe your role to your community and your city is?
That was Coby Lefkowitz, urbanist, real estate developer, writer, and professor. Coby is part of a new generation shaping how we think about housing, cities, and the policies that govern them. His work bridges practice and ideas, theory, and execution. You can follow Coby's writing and commentary on X, and you can read more of his thinking in his book, Building Optimism: Why Our World Looks the Way It Does, and How to Make It Better. Thanks so much for joining us. If you found this conversation valuable, share it with a colleague working across the built environment, and subscribe to the Brick and Wonder podcast for more deep dives this season. The Brick and Wonder podcast is produced by Shayna Danzinger, with sound engineering by Garrett DeBlock. The production staff also included Brick and Wonder team members Ed Thompson, Carrie Potter, and Roya Osuli. I'm Drew Lang, and you've been listening to the Brick and Wonder podcast.